Hello, and welcome to this first of several videos in my video series on how to play basic violin. My name is Robert, and if you want to follow this and other video series, you can either check out my YouTube channel, which is Hayden Music Academy, or you can go to my website, which is www.haydenmusicacademy.com. Now, in this first lesson, we're just going to be going through the very, very basic elements of what the violin is, what the bow is, and how to do some basic, simple bow strokes. We're going to talk a little bit about hand positions and all that stuff. Now, you do not need to have a musical background in order to follow this first video. In fact, the first couple of videos, you're really not going to need a musical background. So don't panic if you've never actually played an instrument or if you don't know how to read sheet music yet. Reading sheet music is going to come a little bit later on, but for now, we're just going to focus primarily on technique. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that this video is intended to be a supplement for you to be able to learn how to study the violin, but it is very, very highly recommended that you get a private music teacher, because the last thing you want to do is try to follow along with the video and start practicing and not realize that you might be doing something wrong, something that a teacher might be able to connect with instantly and tell you, wait a second, the way you're holding your bow looks a little bit funny. The way that you're placing your fingers isn't correct. And one of the hardest things for us musicians is to all of a sudden have to go back and fix something that we've trained our fingers or our hands to do, and suddenly unlearn that behavior and relearn the correct behavior. If you make some time with a violin teacher, even if it's just once or twice a month, they can kind of stop the problem in its tracks and correct it right away. So use this video as you wish, but I highly encourage you to get some private instruction as well. Now, the other thing is that I'm going to be talking about, not necessarily in this video, but in the next one, about finger placements. What I would recommend is that you have either a violin instructor or somebody at a violin shop put the finger tapes on for you. They're little tapes that go right underneath the strings that guide your fingers on where they need to be placed. There are websites that do give measurements on where the tape should go if you don't want to go to a teacher. But the problem is, if the tape is even slightly off, you might again start training your fingers to go into the wrong place, and that's the last thing you want to do at this beginning stage. Learning the violin is hard enough as it is. You don't want to learn something incorrectly. So either go to a music teacher or even go into a music shop and say, here's my violin. I really am hoping that maybe you could put a few finger tapes on for me so that I can practice on my own until I'm ready to get some private instruction. Okay, so with that having been said, let's talk a little bit about this instrument, which is such a beautiful instrument and yet so incredibly difficult to learn. But what I will promise you is that even though the beginning stage can be very, very frustrating, it does get much, much better as time goes on. Okay, so let's talk about the violin first, and let me just point out a couple of aspects of the violin that will help you as you go along. The first aspect is these little pegs down here. These are what we call tuning pegs. Now, unless you have a musician's ear, I don't recommend that you try to tune the violin on your own just yet. The reason for that is if you try to tune the peg too tight, you might actually wind up breaking a string, and then you would have to bring it to somebody to have them change the string for you. It's much easier for you to have someone tune the violin. Like I say, a private instructor is ideal, but certainly try not to tune the violin yourself unless you already have previous music experience, unless you really know what an E sounds like or what an A sounds like. I wouldn't recommend trying to do it on your own. Now, this black part on the violin right here is called the fingerboard, and it's called that specifically for that purpose. This is where your fingers are going to go when you're playing different notes on different strings. The one place you don't want to place your fingers is in this little empty spot right here. This spot right here is where the bow is going to go, and it's what we call in music and violin the contact point. That's exactly where your bow hair is going to go when you're playing the violin. Now, the reason you don't want to touch it with your fingers is because, as much as we try to wash our hands and stuff, sometimes a little bit of grease and oil from our fingers might get onto the strings. And if we put it right on that spot, what's going to happen is it's going to transfer over to the bow hair, and it's going to make the bow hair very slippery. And we don't want the bow hair to be slippery. We want the bow hair to be nice and firm and grasp the string, not slide across it like a sheet of ice, okay? Now, speaking of down here, this thing holding up the strings right in the middle, right here, this little wood piece is called the bridge. And the bridge is a small little piece of wood, but it's very important because it elevates the string so that the bow can be able to touch a single string without touching any of the others. Okay, and then you have this part down here, which is called the tailpiece. You might notice on some violins there might be little, smaller little screws down here that are called fine tuners. Sometimes if you get one of those high strings and it's so close to being in tune, but it's just a little bit too high or a little bit too low, you can do these small little adjustments with the fine tuners in order to get it exactly right. Okay, and then you might notice a couple of things down here. This is called the chin rest, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's where your chin is going to rest on the violin. Helps give you a little bit of support so it feels a lot less slippery. And then there's this thing on the back, this black thing right here. This is called the shoulder rest. As you can see, mine just comes right off. It's completely separate. It's not part of the violin. I put it on as an accessory because, I don't know about you, but I actually have a very long neck. And because of that, I need a little bit of extra support underneath my chin in order for me to hold the violin a lot more comfortably. And so there are different types of shoulder rests. If you have any questions about the best type of shoulder rest, you can always email me at my website. If you have any questions or concerns about what kind of shoulder rest to get, everybody is different. Everybody has a different body type. Everybody has a different length of neck. And so for some people, they might need a big shoulder rest. For some people, they might need a small shoulder rest. Some might choose to not have a shoulder rest at all. It really just depends on the violinist. So that's just a very, very quick overview of the violin. But now let's talk about this bow for a second. Now there's a lot less hardware to talk about here. Obviously this is the horsehair. Now some beginner bows are actually, they use what we call imitation or artificial horsehair. The only difference is one is from real horses, one is not. The artificial horsehair tends to be very, very strong. Real horsehair has a better quality to it, and it grips the string a lot more easily. But after much wear and tear, especially with us professional level violinists, it starts to break. And so, once or twice a year sometimes, depending on how many hours a day we practice, we actually have to bring the bow in and get it re-haired because it starts to, the hair will start to break off. The nice part about the artificial horsehair is that it hardly ever breaks off. It's very, very strong and durable. It just tends to grip the string a little bit less than the natural horsehair. And so as a result, most of the professionals tend to go with the authentic horsehair bows. Don't worry about what kind of bow hair that you have right now. I just wanted to point out the difference just in case you were wondering. Then, of course, we have the wood here. Down at this end with all this little hardware down here, this is called the frog of the bow. And there are a couple of things. There's this little finger grip that kind of makes it a little bit easier for the finger to grip onto the bow. I'll explain about the bow hold in a few minutes. Down here, we have this little peg that actually tightens and loosens the horsehair. This is very, very important. What you don't want to do is, number one, you don't want to over-tighten the bow. And to tighten the bow hair, you turn clockwise until the hair starts to stiffen up. And what you'll notice is that the wood starts to stiffen up as well. But what you don't want is to over-tighten it to the point where the wood starts to point upwards instead of downwards. The wood should always curve down towards the hair. And so if you start to tighten this thing and it starts to all of a sudden creep up instead of creep down, that's when you know it's a little bit too tight. Okay? The other thing, and this is very important, is when you are done practicing, you should loosen the horsehair to a point where, it starts to hang off just a little bit. It doesn't have to be completely loose. But you want to make sure you undo the tension in the wood, because if the bow remains tightened, even when you're not using it. After a while, the tension in the bow will cause it to warp to one side, and that's an almost irreparable problem if that happens to the bow. Now, if you have an imitation wood bow, it's unlikely that the plastic is going to warp, but it definitely does happen very often with wood bows. And so make sure after you're done practicing, just loosen it a few screws, make sure it's just a little bit loose in the horsehair, and then you can put the bow away. And then when you take it back out to practice again, you just tighten it up. Okay? So the other end of the bow is just simply called the tip. And so sometimes when we're talking about bow strokes, we might say from frog to tip or from tip to frog. Okay? So those are the two parts of the bow. Now I want to talk about bow grip. So there are two types of bow grips. The one that I'm going to demonstrate today is what I call a beginner's bow grip. It helps to kind of just give you a sense of how to hold the bow. But then there's a more advanced bow grip that us professional level players will use. And you'll be learning that a little bit later on in the series. Okay? But for the beginner's bow grip, what you want to do is form your hand in the shape of a C, kind of like this. And so what I'm going to do is, you see this little metal piece right on the bottom of the frog, right before where the horsehair begins. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the tip of my thumb, or the pad of my thumb, right on that piece of metal. And then I'm going to form my hand in the shape of a C, kind of like this. And then what I'm going to do with my index finger is I'm going to turn my hand until my index finger is leaning into the wood. So you'll notice it's going to hit the side of the finger just a little bit. And where you want the wood to be placed on the index finger is in between the first and second knuckles, like right in the middle of the finger. So that is basically right about where you want your index finger. Now, these two fingers are going to lightly go along the side of the frog, along this black piece right here. And then the pinky is going to go boop right on top. And so if you feel comfortable enough, you should be able to hold the bow like this. Now you might feel a little bit of pressure in your pinky. That's okay. That's going to go away as soon as you put the bow on the strings, which you're going to do in about 30 seconds. Okay? So this is like the beginner's bow stroke. As I say, this is not the bow stroke that you'll be using forever on the violin, but it is a good start in order to start using the bow. Now, let's talk about left hand position for a second with the violin. So a lot of people ask me at the beginning stage, what's the best angle to hold the violin? Should it be out front? Should it be out to the side? Should it be somewhere in the middle? I like to call it what I call 10 o'clock position. So if I'm sitting straight and this is 12 o'clock to me, from my perspective, then 10 o'clock is going to be somewhere over around here. And so this is, in my opinion, a very, very good, solid position to hold your violin, a good angle to hold it. You don't want it too far out front, because eventually when you get to the really advanced level, you're going to want to shift all the way up the fingerboard. And you're not going to be able to do so if your violin is all the way out here. Your shoulder angle and your elbow, it's just not going to be flexible nearly enough to be able to play those really high notes. On the other hand, if you play all the way out here, the problem is it makes it very difficult for the bow to be able to get straight, because you need to be able to meet the bow and the violin halfway. And so the last thing you want to do is have your violin all the way out here, and then all of a sudden your bow arm has to reach all the way out very awkwardly in order to play. Okay? So 10 o'clock position is right about where we want. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my violin gently underneath my chin, just like this. I'm going to be facing forward. Some people might lean a little bit, tilt their head just slightly. The object is, if you're comfortable enough, and if you're not, that's okay. You might need a shoulder rest in order to give this level of comfort, but it would be ideal if you could get to the point where you could comfortably do this, meaning hold the violin up solely with your chin and shoulder without using your hand. The only reason that becomes important is because it enables the hand to feel very light. You want your left hand to feel very, very light when you're playing the violin. You don't want to feel like you're holding on for dear life or it's like a vice grip, because not only does that cause undue tension in the hands that can hurt after a while, but also it makes it very difficult to be able to play fast and agile like, which is our object with this very, very difficult instrument, okay? So let's bring our violin up again. Okay. Now in this lesson, we're only going to be doing just the open strings. I mean, we're not going to use any fingers just yet. So I'm not going to worry about where I'm holding the violin. The only thing I want to make sure of is that I'm not touching the strings with my fingers just yet. That's going to come in the next video in this tutorial series. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is what we call a down bow on the E string. Now, the E string is the string all the way furthest over to the right. It's the highest string. It should sound the highest of all the strings on your violin, provided that the violin is tuned correctly. Okay? And so what we're going to do is what's called a down bow. A down bow means you start somewhere near the frog of the bow, and you end near the tip of the bow. So a down bow is going to look a little something like this. Now I'm going to demonstrate first and then I'm going to explain before you try it, okay? So here's what a down bow on the E string looks like. Okay? Now, one thing to note what I did is I made sure that I kept my bow hair in the same spot in between the bridge and the fingerboard at all times. We talked about that a little bit earlier. It's what's called the contact point. What you don't want is your bow to drift or to be in the wrong area. You want it to be right in between the bridge and the fingerboard. That's where you get the best, cleanest sound. If it starts to drift near the fingerboard, the sound becomes muffled. If it drifts near the bridge, it starts to sound scratchy and really unpleasant. Okay? So now let's try it together once. And don't worry, we're going to do this a lot. We're not going to rush ahead too quickly. We're going to take our time with this. So let's try a down bow right now. Ready? And go. Okay. See if you can watch the bow here to see if it stays in the same place. Let's try it again. And. Okay. Now you'll notice something that's very important, and I'll be talking about this in my tutorial series about bow angles and your bow arm. It's very important that you lead with your wrist instead of the shoulder. That's going to become extremely important, especially when we start playing on other strings, because the E string is probably the easiest string to play on, which is why we started at this beginning level. But when you start having to play across the different strings, it's very easy to go crooked if you start leading from back here in the elbow. When I do my bow stroke, it's the wrist that generates the motion, not the elbow. Okay? So let's try it again and see if you can keep that bow smack dab in between the bridge and the fingerboard. And. Okay? Now, if you notice a little bit of a scratch, sometimes what happens when you scratch, it can be a number of things. Either the bow is going crooked. Like I said, the bow is very picky. It wants to go at a perfect right angle to the strings. So if it's at a different angle, that's when you start to get that awful, crunching sound. The other thing that can cause the crunching sound is if you're pressing too hard on the bow and if it's too slow. If there's too much pressure pushing down on the bow and it's too slow, the friction against the string causes it to make that unpleasant, that horrible sound that we don't want to do. And so in order to avoid that, you move the bow a little bit quickly in order to make sure the bow glides across the string. It doesn't jam into the string with too much friction, okay? Let's do one more down bow, or perhaps a couple more down bows in a row. Let's try one more. And. Okay, how about just one more just for good measure, okay? And. Okay, so if you're comfortable enough doing that, now we're going to do an up bow, which sounds exactly the way it is. It's the opposite direction. We're going to go from tip to frog this time. And so it's very important, like I say, when you go up, use the wrist instead of the elbow. Don't lead from back here, lead from this wrist. So let's put our bow on the string near the tip, and let's go up. And. Okay, so you notice again, as I go up, the wrist starts to bend in order for me to make sure that the bow stays straight. If I don't do that, if I lead from the elbow, here's what happens. And you can see all of a sudden my bow is crooked at the frog. And suppose I had to do another down bow right after that, I would be crooked immediately on the down bow. And so it's very important to use the wrist as you go up. Okay, let's do it again. And. Okay, and I check my bow angle. I'm like, oh, look at that. It's perfectly straight. That's the object. Okay, how about we just do one more? Very, very, very good. Now, what I highly recommend at this beginning stage, in order to get your bow to stay straight, is to practice on the open strings in front of a mirror. Because when you're looking down at the violin like this, it's very difficult for you to be able to see if this is straight, if this is straight, or if this is straight. Now, obviously, if I was standing over there, I would be able to tell, oh no, this is the straight angle. That's the only angle that I should be playing at. But sometimes when you're looking straight down at the instrument, it can be a little bit hard to see from that perspective. If you practice in front of a mirror, just on the open strings, just doing open bow strokes, and watch your wrist and make sure that you're leading with the wrist, then you'll be able to make sure the bow stays straight. And that's going to go a long way to avoiding a lot of frustration. The bow arm, sometimes it kind of gets less attention than the fingers once you start to get into the more advanced level. But it is very, very important because the fingers can be working 6 ways till Sunday. But if this hand is out to lunch, you're not going to get the sound that you're looking for, and you're going to be doing all this work in the left hand for absolutely nothing. Okay? So before we wrap up today, we're going to do one more thing. And that is we're going to do the same bow strokes on the next string over, which is called the A string. It's the second string, one string over from the E string. So it's the second string over right here. Okay? So this is where it gets a little bit trickier, because on the E string, we don't have another string all the way over here on the right-hand side to contend with. And so if our bow angle is slightly off, we're not going to clip another string over here. With the A string, it's very important that we get the wrist angle and the elbow angle just right so that we don't start hitting the low string or the high string. Otherwise, we're playing 2 strings at the same time. Okay? So this, again, is the A string. It's the one right next to the E string that we just played. So let's try a down bow on the A string together. Ready? And. Okay? And check your bow angle. Make sure the bow is still in that smack dab place right between the bridge and the fingerboard. Let's try it a couple of times. If you start to hear the lower string, then you need to drop your elbow and your wrist just a little bit, because that means that you've got this too high, and that's when you start to hear the wrong string. So you just want to hear the A string. Let's do it again. And. Okay. Let's try it one more time just for good measure. And. Okay. Now the A string is a little bit thicker than the E string. And so that means it's going to be a little bit less reactive to the bow. The thicker the string, the less reactive it is. And so that means that the bow has to be absolutely dead on precise in order for you to get good sound out of it. Okay? Like I say, if you hear crunching, it's usually an indication that there's too much pressure and not enough speed. So lighten up just a little bit and move the bow a little bit faster if you start to hear crunching. Now let's do an up bow on the A string. Okay, and again, you notice as I go up, I'm leading with the wrist. Same thing, and. Okay, so like I say, always lead with that wrist. Don't lead with the elbow. One more time, and. Okay, so that is the first introduction to playing, and you've already played 2 notes on the violin. Congratulations. But the next lesson gets a little bit more interesting, because that's when we have to start using fingers. And so I hope you enjoyed this lesson tutorial, and if you want to follow more or ask me any questions, please feel free to visit my website at www.haydenmusicacademy.com. See you next time.